This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today we're continuing with my limited set review for Theros Beyond Death. Yesterday we looked at white, today we're going to look at all the blue cards, and throughout the next several days we're going to look at all the rest of them. This is a series of videos where I talk about how good I think all the cards in Theros Beyond Death will be in limited for the format, which means draft and sealed. Keep in mind, these grades, these discussions are all sort of based on my initial impressions, not on actually having played the cards. It's impossible to be 100% right, and obviously this is all open for discussion. That kind of discussion is good for all of us to get better at limited, so feel free to comment if you disagree with stuff. Our first blue card is Illyrios Enraptured, who for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 legendary human at uncommon. He enters the battlefield tapped. He doesn't untap during your untap step if you control a reflection, and when he enters the battlefield, you create a 3/2 blue reflection creature token. This is a really flavorful reference to the Greek myth of Narcissus, and maybe one of the most flavorful cards in the entire set, and he's also really good in limited. A 3 mana for a 2/3 and a 3/2 is obviously completely insane, and that is what this gives you. But there is a downside. If the reflection is in play, Illyrios is too busy staring at his own reflection to actually do anything, so he just stays tapped. But I think that's honestly okay. You can use the 3/2 as an attacker or use it to trade with something, at which point Illyrios will start to untap and he can do the same. I don't imagine getting a 2-for-1 with this will be all that difficult, even with Illyrios being tapped for a while. One 3-mana card that gives you 6/6 combined stats, even with the downside, is pretty strong. If you can blink him and flash him and bounce him and things like that too, you can also make more reflections, which is pretty nice. I think this is going to be a first pick in a lot of packs. I think it's one of the better uncommons in the set. It's better than a lot of the rares. I'm giving him a straight up B. Next up, we have Ashiok's Erasure, who for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you exile a spell. Your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as the exiled card, and when Ashiok's Erasure leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled card to its owner's hand. In limited, this is going to amount to being a 4-mana counterspell, with the significant downside of giving the opponent back their card should they ever get rid of the enchantment. Also has the upside of exiling the card, which does matter, but that's still not very good in limited. 4 mana is too much to leave up, and it can be too easily played around. Obviously, this is going to be better in Constructed, where the part that prevents the casting of cards with the same name will actually come up, but it just won't happen much in Limited. I hesitate to give this a straight-up F, since I think it's probably going to make the cut as a 23rd card sometimes, and it might actually be decent against opponents with higher mana curves, but most of the time you shouldn't play this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, we have Brine Giant, who for 6 generic and a blue is a 5/6 giant at common, and he costs 1 less to cast for each enchantment you control. Basically, he has affinity for enchantments. I think you need to consistently only be paying 5 for this for it to be worth it, and even 5 isn't anything impressive. Once you get down to 4, though, you're going to be doing some serious business. This seems like a solid inclusion in enchantment-heavy decks, but it isn't really the kind of card that will pull you into blue. It's just a big vanilla creature. I think that makes it a C. Next up, we have Caliphate, Beloved of the Sea, who for 1 generic and 2 blue is a star 3, legendary enchantment creature demigod at uncommon. Her power is equal to your devotion to blue. It's the first time we've seen devotion in this video. It's a mechanic in this set, a returning mechanic from the original Theros. And your devotion is equal to the number of blue mana symbols there are in your casting costs on cards you have in play. So even Caliphate on her own gives you 2 devotion to blue. She also says creatures and enchantments you control have spells your opponents cast that target this permanent cost 1 more to cast. So at worst, this is a 3-mana 2/3 that makes your opponent's removal spells cost more. What would that be? Probably at least a C. Making your opponent pay more for removal means your opponent will have a much harder time finding a way to trade up with their removal spells, and obviously means it will take them longer to cast them. Then, this will frequently be at least a 3-mana 3/3 with that ability. And if you're doing that, you're kind of in business, especially because it can even get bigger than that. If it were always a 3-mana 3/3 that taxed your opponents when they try to target your creatures, it would probably be a C+, and it does have the upside of being even bigger than that, but I think we kind of have to say that 3-mana 3/3 is probably pretty typical. More than that isn't super likely. It can happen and it will happen, but you can't count on it, and I think that makes this a C+. Next, we have Chain to Memory, which for 1 blue is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -4/-0 until end of turn, scry 2. This is a good example of how adding Scry 2 to something makes it considerably better. I am basically never a fan of a card that gives a creature -4, -0, and nothing more, or any sort of like minus power effect. The reason for this is it's difficult to turn a card with that effect into anything meaningful, assuming that's all that it's doing. Sure, sometimes it allows you to set up a block that kills a creature, but more frequently, it just makes it so you can block a creature or prevent its damage and not much else, and using a whole card on that isn't worth it, and that's why I usually give a card like this an F. This set does have an archetype focused on doing stuff on your opponent's turn, so it's going to be a little bit better, but luckily for Chain to Memory, it also does something else with Scry 2. Scry 2 isn't quite draw a card, but it gets pretty close. That's some serious card selection that will improve the quality of your draws. As a result, I think this will be the kind of card that makes the cut sometimes instead of something you never want to play. It still isn't all that good, but a D+ is a big upgrade from F. Next up, we have Deny the Divine, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target creature or enchantment spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. This is a solid counterspell, something we don't see in every limited format, especially at common. 3 mana to counter what are probably going to be the 2 most common card types in this format, plus exiling that spell is pretty nice. It reminds me a lot of No Escape from War of the Spark. While this one doesn't have Scry, I figure it will perform similarly, which is to say, this is a counterspell that you're usually fine about playing one of in your blue decks, especially if your deck has payoffs for doing stuff on your opponent's turn. This is a C. Next up, we have Eidolon of Philosophy, which for 1 blue is a 1/2 enchantment creature spirit at common, and you can pay 6 generic and a blue to sacrifice it and draw 3 cards. This is pretty interesting and a lot like Shorekeeper, a card we've seen recently, and I imagine this will be about as good. A 1 mana 1/2 just isn't worth a card most of the time, but having the ability to draw 3 cards in the late game is kind of nice. It's also an enchantment, which certainly will matter in this format. Most decks won't be interested in this, though, but if you have a sweet control deck, playing one of these won't be too bad. Still, most decks should avoid this, and that's why I think it's only a D+. Next up, we have Elite Instructor, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, then discard a card. I'm a fan of looting, and it's going to be even more useful in a format with escape and other graveyard stuff. A 3 mana 2/2 isn't so good, obviously. That would be probably an F at best, but I think adding the loot trigger does enough for this to make the cut in your deck a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Glimpse of Freedom, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant, and it says draw a card. It also has Escape, a new mechanic in this set that lets you pay mana and exile cards from your graveyard to cast a card from your graveyard. For Glimpse of Freedom, you pay 2 generic and a blue, and you have to exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So this is a lot like Think Twice, a card that has been pretty decent and limited. Basically, this card always gets you a 2-for-1, provided you can cast it from your hand and with Escape once. It doesn't do its job efficiently, but it does do it. Glimpse of Freedom can grant you even more card advantage too, since unlike Flashback, Escape does not exile the card you cast. Granted, you have to be able to stock up your graveyard pretty well to pull it off more than once, but it isn't super far-fetched to imagine casting it twice with Escape. The blue-red deck in this format is also about casting cards during your opponent's turn, and this potentially gives you several opportunities to activate those triggers. Still, it is definitely pretty clunky, and I think that holds it down to a C. It's something you will play the first copy of most of the time when you have it, but I don't think you're pumped about it or anything like that, unless you can really load up your graveyard and have a lot of good blue-red, do stuff on your opponent's turn payoffs. Next up, it's Ichthyomorphosis, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue fish with base power and toughness 0/1. This is pretty typical of a blue removal spell. It's a necessary evil kind of thing. It does its job, but it doesn't do it super well, even in a format that cares about enchantments. It's nice that it turns off all of the creature's abilities and all of that, but this type of removal spell always underwhelms because while, yes, you dealt with their best creature, the fact that they can chump block with it is always frustrating. Good removal doesn't let your opponents chump block. Now, I'm not saying it's bad, just that this is held back from a premium removal grade in the B range. Instead, it's just a C+. Next up, we have Kiora Best's the Sea God, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a Mythic Rare enchantment Saga. Its first chapter creates an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token with hexproof. The second chapter taps all non-land permanents target opponent controls, and then they don't untap during their controller's next untap step. And then chapter 3 lets you gain control of target permanent an opponent controls and untap it. Well, if you're going to cost 7 mana, you better do something impactful, and this Saga definitely is. 7 mana for an 8/8 hexproof up front is pretty good, but probably wouldn't quite be a bomb or anything like that all on its own, just because it's a huge creature who, yeah, can't be removed by anything, but it can be chump blocked forever. But then when you add the other pieces here, you definitely have a bomb. Tapping everything but lands for a turn is great. It means your giant Kraken will put in some work the turn after it came down. And then the third chapter lets you do one of the most powerful things in the game, which is steal one of your opponent's creatures. And actually, it's permanent, so any permanent is usually going to be a creature, but hey, you can steal your opponent's sagas and things like that as well. So 7 mana is the right cost here, because all of those things together, even though they slowly sort of happen, from turn to turn, all of those things together is absolutely incredibly powerful. Will every deck want this? It kind of depends on how slow the format is, but I can't imagine very many blue decks that won't find a way to play this. It's just going to win you the game so often, and unlike some other sagas, it does stuff that makes it pretty hard for you to be dead by the time you get to that third chapter. And once that third chapter goes off, it's going to be near impossible for your opponent to have a shot at beating you. The fact it costs 7 mana does hold it back, even if it is giving you 7 mana worth of value. There will just be games where you can't get that 7th mana. It just doesn't always happen in Magic, and that makes it hard to give this a straight up A, but it's an A-. You'll first pick it every time you see it. Next up, we have Meadowmai's Prophecy, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment saga. Its first chapter scries 2. The second chapter, you choose a card name. The third chapter says when you cast a spell with the chosen name for the first time this turn, draw 2 cards. And the fourth chapter says look at the top card of each player's library. This is a fun design. That's something that can be said about a lot of these sagas, really. So the turn you play this, you get to scry 2 and get some information about what's on top of your deck. The next turn, you choose a card name. That part's pretty disappointing because it doesn't actually do anything on that particular turn, but on turn 3, if you cast the named card, and you should, you get to draw 2 cards. Then the last chapter gives you a little more information about you and your opponent's deck. That part, not so impressive. So what will this amount to most of the time? 2 mana to scry 2 and draw 2. Sure, it takes a while to get there, and you have to cast a spell to draw those 2 cards, so it isn't quite that good, but you get my point. This is going to give you card selection and card advantage in a lot of situations. The fact it's so slow to do it is kind of a problem, but playing this on turn 2 seems alright. Sometimes playing this in the later part of the game when you're really under pressure and you really need to draw the cards, that's not going to feel so great. But if you're playing it in the early game, it's nice. And even late, if you're scrying 2, you're going to increase your chances of surviving because you're going to be drawing more of what you need. In the end, I think this is just solid filler, sort of a really weird divination. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Memory Drain, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a common instant that says counter target spell, scry 2. Memory Drain does a good job of illustrating just how much more 4 mana is than 3 mana when you're talking about a counterspell, especially when 2 of it is colored. We talked earlier about how Deny the Divine is a playable counterspell. Meanwhile, I think Memory Drain is only marginally playable. 4 mana counterspells are just brutal most of the time, since you have to leave up so much mana for them, so when your opponent just plays around it, you find yourself in a horrible place for not using your mana on the previous turn. Now, I do think this might be a little bit better than usual in this set, once again, because of the blue-red archetype, which is going to be all about doing stuff on your opponent's turn. Because of that archetype, there's a bunch of flash in this set, and so you can leave mana up for a flash spell or Memory Drain and just use whichever one makes the most sense. And in those cases, your opponent playing around your Memory Drain isn't going to hurt you as much. But I still can't really get behind a 4 mana counterspell in Limited that doesn't do something really significant. I think this is basically, the same card as Ashiok's Erasure. The Erasure exiles the spell, Memory Drain doesn't, but it scries 2. They're both mediocre counterspells with some mediocre upside, and they're both Ds. Next up, we have Nader Kraken, who for 1 generic and 2 blue is a rare Kraken. And whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1 generic, and if you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Nader Kraken and create a 1/1 blue tentacle creature token. And it's a 2/3. I like this card a lot. It's one of the ones I'm most excited to play with. If you're allowed to untap with it, you end up with a 3/4 and a 1/1, which is excellent for a 4 mana investment, and it just starts to snowball from there. Every 1 mana you spend on cards you draw adds 2 more power to the board. It's always going to feel great. Obviously, if you have additional ways to draw cards, it can get even sillier. This is a bomb. That isn't something you say about a lot of 3-drops, but you can say it here. It can take over the game no matter when you play it. The one downside it has is that it is pretty vulnerable initially as a 2-3, but it can grow big enough to avoid a lot of removal pretty quickly. And even if you only get 2 or 3 turns with this, you're doing a great job, and if you get more than that, you probably just win. I do think its initial vulnerability holds it to an A-, but you're going to first pick it, 99.9% of the time. Next up, we have Naiad of Hidden Coves, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2-3 enchantment creature nymph at common, and as long as it's not your turn, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So, as we've seen on a few cards already, and as I've mentioned, blue, and specifically blue-red, is interested in casting stuff on your opponent's turn, and has nice payoffs for that, and Naiad of the Hidden Coves is one of those. Reducing the cost of your instants and cards with flash is pretty nice, as it will enable you to trigger your other payoffs more easily and cast more powerful spells sooner. The fact that this also comes with a semi-reasonable body is nice too. They could easily have printed this as a 2-2, and it still would have been decent, so I'm pretty happy with 2-3 here. You don't want to take this super early, but if you find yourself in a deck that's interested in instants and cards with flash, this will be pretty nice. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Nyxborn Seaguard, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 2-5 enchantment creature merfolk soldier at common. This is the blue card in the Nyxborn cycle, and it's just as underwhelming as most of the other ones. The black one might be at least whelming, I guess. But anyway, a 4-mana 2-5 is kind of okay stats, and this is an enchantment, so yeah, sometimes you'll play it because of that, and sometimes you'll play it because you need a defensive 4-drop, but most of the time you won't, and that's a D+. Next up, we have Omen of the Sea, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2 and then draw a card. You can pay 2 generic and a blue to sacrifice it and scry 2. The blue Omen seems solid. 2 mana to scry 2 and draw a card at instant speed is already kind of a reasonable thing. It's sort of comparable to Anticipate. That probably is enough for this to be a C- in most formats, but the fact you can use it to scry later on in the game, and the fact it will be right at home in a few different decks in this format, both those interested in enchantments and those interested in doing stuff on the opponent's turn, those things make it enough for it to be a solid C. I don't imagine cutting the first copy in most blue decks. Next, we have One with the Stars, which for 3 generic and a blue is an enchantment aura at uncommon. It can enchant a creature or an enchantment. An enchanted permanent is an enchantment and loses all other card types. This is a pretty typical blue removal spell, kind of like we saw with Ichthyomorphosis. It does the job, but it doesn't do it super efficiently, and sometimes it won't do it all that effectively. Turning a creature into an enchantment is nice, since it keeps it from attacking or blocking, but the fact that this doesn't turn off abilities is going to be a problem a decent chunk of the time, as is the fact that you have to pay 4 mana for the effect. Normally, if you're paying 4 mana for removal, you want something a little more foolproof, and that's not what this is. Now, I'm not saying this is bad, just that it isn't premium removal. Blue usually doesn't get that, and that's true here, even with the fact that this is an enchantment. It's a C+, you'll play the first copy in blue decks all the time, but beyond that, you kind of hope for something better. Next, we have Protean Thaumaturge, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1-1 human wizard at rare. It's got Constellation, and it says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may have Protean Thaumaturge become a copy of another target creature, except it has this ability. A 2-mana 1-1 is usually a liability, but the Constellation trigger here is too attractive to not want this card. If you play an enchantment, this will become whatever the best creature on the battlefield is, either giving you a second copy of your best creature or giving you a creature to match your opponent's best creature, and it doesn't just last until end of turn. It lasts until you play another enchantment, and that's only if you want it to transform again, because it's a May clause. So yeah, Constellation is a hoop you have to jump through, but luckily that won't be too difficult in this set. While I think there will be times you just don't have an enchantment and this won't be good, I think most of the time you can make this card work for you, and I think I want to start the format taking it pretty early, giving it a B-. Next up, we have Riptide Turtle, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 0-5 turtle at common, and it has Flash and Defender. I'm not especially interested in this guy. A Defender with Flash is pretty pointless. In this set, yes, it's a little less pointless because of the blue-red archetype, but it's still pretty pointless. Flashing this in will surprise your opponent, sure, but it won't have any sort of meaningful effect. A 2-mana 0-5 is kind of efficient as far as a creature with Defender goes, but the inability to ever take anything down in combat means that the blocking quickly becomes less relevant as the game goes on. I think you'll play this in some blue-red decks that need some help getting to the late game, but it will be avoided more often than it'll be played. I'm giving it a D. Next up we have Sage of Mysteries, which is 1 blue for a 0/2 human wizard at uncommon. It has Constellation, and in this case, when an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So this gives you a card that could potentially help you mill out the opponent alongside another card, another uncommon card we'll see later in this video. It looks like a deck that will come together sometimes, but because 2 of the best cards for it are uncommons, it might be a challenge. The best use for this in some decks might actually be to mill yourself, so you can set up escape and other graveyard things more efficiently. Still, I don't think most of the time you'll play this. There will be some corner cases where it will fit, and that keeps it from getting a straight F, but I'm giving it a D. Next up, we have Sea God Scorn, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says return up to 3 target creatures and or enchantments to their owner's hands. This kind of card always seems to disappoint. Don't get me wrong, what it does is pretty powerful. It can completely reshape the board, and it will be especially nice to bounce things that cost more than 6 mana total, so you're coming out ahead mana-wise. The problem is, it's pretty impossible to come out ahead card-wise. Sure, your opponent has to recast everything, but if you can't win the game quickly after casting the Scorn, you're in trouble. The other problem a card like this always has is most blue decks probably aren't that interested in an effect like this. This will mostly only be good in more aggressive decks who can get the opening they want after casting this. Problem is, it costs 6 mana, and many aggressive decks don't really want to go there. In a mid-rangey or control decks, it is less appealing, since setting up a situation where it wins you the game will be more challenging. Also worth noting that you can bounce your own stuff with this, and sometimes that's the right thing to do. Now, I know I just said a lot of negative stuff about this card, but I don't think it's terrible or anything. I'm just trying to convey that pretty much every time we see this card, it seems like it's going to be pretty good and it underperforms. Still, it's not an especially replaceable effect, and I think it will make the cut often enough that it's still a C. Next up, we have Shimmerwing Chimera, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 enchantment creature chimera at uncommon. It's got flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, return up to 1 other target enchantment you control to its owner's hand. This is interesting. A 4 mana 3/2 with flying is usually like a C-, but this comes with something extra, the ability to bounce enchantments. Now, it is important to note that it says up to 1, which means you don't have to bounce any enchantments if you don't want to. When I first saw this card, I didn't see May, so I assumed you had to do it, but that's not the case. And that's good, because it means that the upkeep ability of the Chimera is only ever going to be upside, and upside on a 4 mana 3/2 flyer is pretty nice. Now, there will be plenty of times where this is nothing more than a 3/2 flyer, but you can combine this with some other things to be pretty nasty. This includes the Omen cycle, as well as sagas and enchantment creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and it also includes taking an aura off of one of your less important creatures now and putting it on maybe your evasive Chimera. Less excitingly, you can return an enchantment-based removal spell to your hand and put it on something new that has come down since you casted it. So this will provide some nice value some of the time and really become something of an engine in some cases, and I think that upside is enough to get it to C+, and I kind of hope it's even better than that. But right now, I don't want to be overly optimistic about it. I'm thinking C+. Next up, we have Shoal Kraken, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/5 Kraken at uncommon. It's got Constellation, and its trigger is that you get to draw a card and discard a card when an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. In other words, loot. I like looting a fair bit, and it gets some extra value in this set because of the escape mechanic, but this card isn't super impressive to me. 5 mana for a 3/5 is not a great rate, and sure, if you manage to loot every single time with this, you're going to feel okay about things, but it's hard to imagine situations where this is really letting you rip through your entire deck, even in a set with this many enchantments. Don't get me wrong, this is solid, just kind of underwhelming as far as an uncommon enchantment payoff goes. I think this is just a C. Next up, I have Sleep of the Dead, which for 1 blue is a common sorcery. It says tap target creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Then as escape, you can pay 2 generic and a blue and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard. This type of freeze effect tends to be at its best in aggressive blue decks since they allow you to have more effective attacks, and it isn't too far-fetched to imagine casting this twice in 1 turn thanks to the escape, at which point you may really be able to find lethal damage out of nowhere. In blue decks that aren't as interested in attacking though, it won't be worthwhile. Slowing your opponent down a little bit with this usually just isn't worth it. I think if there's anywhere this card will work the best, it's probably in blue-white, which sort of looks like the most tempo-y color pair, and it may end up being a little better than this, but for now I think it's just a D+. I think it's better to steer clear of this in most of your blue decks, but it may turn out that blue-white decks can do a little bit better with this than a D+. Next up, we have Starlit Mantle, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with flash. You enchant a creature you control, and when it enters the battlefield, enchanted creature gains hexproof until end of turn, and also enchanted creature gets +1/+1. This seems like yet another solid aura in this set. Being able to cast this in response to an opponent's removal spell will feel amazing, but sometimes just flashing it in for the +1/+1 will be enough to let you win a combat, at which point this becomes a combat trick that sticks around to enhance your creature, which feels pretty good. But yeah, using it in response to removal will be the dream, but I just want to say a lot of the time you should just be using this when any situation presents itself where you can use it to get rid of one of your opponent's cards. In other words, yes, use it in response to removal, but also if you block with your creature, your opponent's tapped out and their creature will die in combat and yours will survive if you give it +1/+1. If you can do that, just flash it in and do that. Don't try to be fancy with the hexproof. You just want to be able to take out an opponent's card with it whenever you can. This is a solid card for blue decks in this format, and I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Stern Dismissal, which for 1 blue is a common instant, and it says return target creature or enchantment an opponent controls to its owner's hand. I'm usually a fan of these type of effects. I like Unsummon usually. It's a little bit different because it can't bounce enchantments, but it can also bounce your creatures. But they're pretty similar cards. They tend to let you get some serious tempo when you spend 1 mana to get rid of something that costs 4 or more, something like that, and that makes it worth going down a card a lot of the time. However, Stern Dismissal is actually better than normal in this format because it can hit enchantments, and I also think it will overperform because of some of the characteristics of this set. This set has way more playable tricks and auras than usual, and that means people are going to be jamming more of them into your deck. Using Stern Dismissal in response to those will not only net you tempo, but also an actual card, since if you bounce the creature, the trick or aura will then have no target and go to the graveyard. Additionally, the blue-red deck in this format wants to be running as many instants as it can, and this works for them too. Normally, an Unsummon type card is a C, but I think Stern Dismissal deserves a C+. Next up, we have Stinging Lionfish, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 enchantment creature fish at uncommon, and whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, you may tap or untap target non-land permanent. A 2-mana 2/1 is usually a D these days, but this comes with a nice trigger for casting stuff on your opponent's turn. Tapping down an opponent's creature is no joke, as it can both allow you to avoid an attack from your opponent's best creature and allow you to have better attacks on your turn. You can also use it to untap one of your creatures at instant speed and surprise your opponent with a block. That said here, I don't love the payoff. Blue-red is definitely going to be interested in having a bunch of instants and cards with flash, and this will be a nice payoff for that, but it's not going to be anything super special. It'll be a solid role player. I think it's just a C. Next up, we have Sweet Oblivion, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, and it has Escape. You can pay 3 generic and a blue and exile 4 other cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard. This is the other uncommon mill card I was talking about, and it's an interesting one. You can use this to mill yourself, something that might be worth doing maybe in a deck with a lot of graveyard synergy, or you can mill your opponent, something that might be worth doing in a control deck that plans on winning the game by milling the opponent. Mill decks don't always come together in formats, but it is nice that this particular mill card can be repeatedly cast from the graveyard if you're stocking your graveyard. In other words, if you're really good at milling yourself and you can provide the cards to fuel Escape, this one card could be enough to win you the game by milling your opponent. Now, one big downside that's important to acknowledge about milling your opponent is you'll be fueling their escape cards. And there's lots of them. We've seen a lot just in blue today. There's lots of escape cards in this format. And if you're milling your opponent and putting escape cards in their graveyard, you're also giving them the fuel to use the escape with them, essentially adding extra cards to their hand. And that's one thing that makes me a little wary about playing mill in this format. I mean, that's just one of the graveyard synergies around. Escape mechanic is one of them. But there's lots of other good graveyard synergy cards in this set. So, whether or not mill is viable in this format will be interesting to see. If it is, I have a feeling Sweet Oblivion will be at the heart of it. But for now, I think this is probably just a D. Next up, we have Thassa, Deep Dwelling, who for 3 generic and a blue is a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god at Mythic Rare. She's indestructible. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, though, she's not a creature at all, so all those things I mentioned mostly don't matter. She has a static ability that says at the beginning of your end step, exile up to one other target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control, and she has an activated ability, which you can pay 3 generic and a blue to tap another target creature. Like all the gods, Thassa is really strong. Her ability to blink creatures every turn isn't amazing, but it can allow you to abuse Enter the Battlefield abilities, and at worst, gives one of your creatures pseudo-vigilance every turn. It also means that she will usually have some impact on the board right away, even if only effectively untapping a creature. Additionally, every color has enchantment-based removal spells at lower rarities, and Thassa can make those fall off of your creatures. On top of that, if you have a ton of mana lying around, she can tap stuff, which is a powerful effect, but it does ask for a lot of mana, though that's a very nice mana sink. Then, of course, if your devotion is high enough, she's a huge indestructible creature. So where does all of that leave us? Well, she needs a little bit of help, and her activated ability is not exactly priced to move, and I think both of those things keep her from being a straight-up bomb, though you're going to first pick her pretty much every time you see her, giving her a B+. Next up, it's Thassa's Intervention, which for X generic mana and 2 blue is a rare instant, and it says choose one. Like all of the interventions, it's a modal card. One option is look at the top X cards of your library, put up to 2 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. The other option is counter target spell unless its controller pays twice X. I'm a pretty big fan of modal counterspells because they overcome the problem counterspells have, and that is that if you leave mana up for it and you don't get anything to counter, you're going to feel horrible. In this case, you have a backup plan. You know, counterspells can be pretty bad if you're the one who's actually behind in the game. You absolutely hate drawing one because it doesn't really matter if you can counter something your opponent hasn't done yet. You need to do something about what's already on the board. And Thassa's Intervention doesn't entirely fix that problem with the counterspell not being so good, but it can help you find something when you need it to. It can help you find something that will help you do something about what's already on the board so you can get back into the game instead of just hanging back as a counterspell that doesn't really matter. Now, to be fair, Thassa's Intervention's other effect isn't going to be great even if you're behind, but I think in general it will be better. So the question becomes whether I want to be first picking this ever, and for now, I think the answer to that is no. It's a card you'll always play in blue, don't get me wrong, but I think I'd rather have premium removal than it pretty much always. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Thassa's Oracle, which for 2 blue mana is a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your devotion to blue, put up to 1 of them on top of your library, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. This is a pretty cool design. All on its own, Thassa's Oracle is basically a 2 mana 1/3 with Scry 2, a card we've seen before in Omen Speaker, which is a solid playable. Obviously, this has a much higher ceiling than Omen Speaker because sometimes you'll be able to look through way more than 2 cards. Additionally, it also has an alternate win condition effect, and honestly, I think this might be one of the more obtainable alternate win conditions we've seen in Limited. Don't get me wrong, you won't be doing it much, but it does seem doable. I think that's the case because this set has a ton of self-mill effects and tons of cards that can help you get your devotion high, and those two things combine to mean that sometimes your devotion will be like 7 and you just want to have that many cards left. Again, not going to happen a ton, but I do want to say it will happen. I don't think you should be first picking the Oracle since most of the time it's basically just Omen Speaker, but I think it has some nice upside and I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Thirst for Meaning, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards, unless you discard an enchantment card. This seems like a pretty nice card to me, and I also like it in terms of the fact that it's just like a common that happens to support basically everything you might be doing in blue. Because this set has a graveyard theme, it helps you there by getting cards in your graveyard. It has an enchantment theme, it's kind of an enchantment payoff because you get to keep more cards if you discard 1 enchantment. And it's an instant, so the blue-red deck will be able to get triggers out of it too. 3 mana to draw 3 at instant speed and discard 2 cards would probably already be a decentish card in any format, a D+ or a C-, but obviously this is better and has some nice synergy in the set as I mentioned, and I think this does enough to push all the way up to a C+, and deep down, I hope it ends up being even better than that. Next up we have Threnody Singer, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 Siren. At uncommon, it's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -X, -0 until end of turn, where X is your devotion to blue. This seems quite good to me. If I hadn't played with Fairy Duelist a few sets ago, I probably wouldn't think this would be that good, but having experienced Fairy Duelist, as many of us have, a card that really overperformed and had a very similar effect, I think Threnody Singer can also perform similarly. A 2-mana 1/3 flyer with upside is usually pretty nice anyway, and this comes with a lot of it. On its own, this is a 2-mana 1/3 flyer with flash that gives -1/-0 to a creature. Again, that's not too dissimilar from Fairy Duelist. This obviously has an even higher ceiling than Fairy Duelist though. It's bigger, has higher toughness, and it can potentially bring down the opponent's power even more. And when you're reducing power enough, you can set up some pretty advantageous blocks that can cause serious problems for the opponent. While the Singer isn't always going to be helping you straight up kill a creature, its fail case is so reasonable that I think that's fine. Worth noting, it also has flash like a lot of cards we've seen, and that's good for the blue-red deck. I think Threnody Singer is good enough to take with the first pick in some weak packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Thrix, the Sudden Storm, who for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/5 legendary elemental giant at rare. He's got flash and flying, and spells you cast with converted mana cost 5 or greater, cost 1 less to cast, and can't be countered. Well, a 5-mana 4/5 flyer is probably already a solid B. When you have a creature this big who has flash, it isn't hard to get a 2-for-1 out of it since it can flash in and ambush much smaller creatures. Then you have a huge efficient flyer who can get the job done in the air. He also makes your expensive spells cheaper and makes them uncounterable. The uncounterable part won't come up a ton in Limited, though we did see decent counter spells so far. And reducing the cost of spells also won't come up a ton, so don't expect that part to matter more than 2 or 3 times during a draft. Of course, that time or 2 is pretty great when attached to a creature this impressive. I think just being a 5-mana 5/4 flyer with flash is probably enough to get close to the bomb range, and the additional ability definitely makes it a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, we have Towering Wave Mystic, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Wizard at common, and when it deals damage, target player puts that many cards from the top of their library into their graveyard. This is nice because it can help you mill your opponent, if that's what you're interested in, as we've mentioned, but it can also mill you. Milling yourself will probably be more useful most of the time, as this format, as we've seen, has lots of graveyard action. It's still a creature with subpar vanilla stats, but I think the fact that it can help stock your graveyard and or mill your opponent is enough for it to be a card you feel decent about playing in your deck. So I'm starting it at a C. Next up, we have Triton Wave Rider, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 Merfolk Wizard at common. Its constellation trigger is that it gains flying when an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. This seems like another solid enchantment payoff. If you can consistently get this guy in the air, you're going to be in business, as a 4-mana 3/3 flyer is no joke, but you shouldn't really count on the Wave Rider being that every turn, but putting an aura on him seems especially nice. He's not going to be the payoff that makes or breaks your constellation deck, but he's going to be the kind of common that is nice filler for the deck. I'm giving him a C. Next up, it's Vexing Gull, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 bird at common with flash, there's a lot of flash, and flying. I'm always happy when they print a bird that is solid and limited, and that is what we have here. 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer used to sort of be the quintessential common creature for blue, and normally was a C. These days, as creatures continue to get stronger, that stat line isn't quite as impressive, but by adding flash to the mix here, you have a pretty nice card. Flash creatures can of course be used to come into play and ambush an attacker, but a 2/2 isn't going to be doing that a ton. Still, being able to play this at instant speed has its bonuses, again the blue-red archetype being one of them. It also doesn't hurt that you can flash this in at the end of your opponent's turn, and if they're tapped out, you can put an aura on it on your turn and be pretty safe. Then of course, flash just makes it so you can leave up instants and activated abilities without really taking a hit on tempo, and all of that's pretty nice. I think this Windrake does enough to get to C. You probably never cut the first copy or 2 of this. Next up, we have Wavebreak Hippocamp, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 enchantment creature, Horsefish. Why are there so many Horsefish in Magic? Anyway, it's a rare. Whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, draw a card. This is definitely a build around because it is nothing more than a 3-mana 2/2 in a deck that doesn't have at least 5 ways to cast things on your opponent's turn. That said, as we've seen just in this video, casting stuff on your opponent's turn, not really going to be a problem in this format. Still, I don't think every blue deck in this format will love this. I think if you don't have a lot of instant speed things going on because you have a lot of creatures in your deck or whatever, it's probably more like a D+. But I don't think it's going to be that hard to make it work, to end up with enough ways to draw the extra cards. I think it's going to be a B+ in a deck that really gets there. And that's a huge disparity, but I think it's good enough that you definitely want to be first picking this. It's just a huge engine that's just going to win you games if it's allowed to stay in play long enough. And our next card is Whirlwind Denial, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant, and it says for each spell and ability your opponents control, counter it unless its controller pays 4. This is another decent counter spell for blue. We've seen several of them, which will also all be better because of all the flash. This in particular is a neat design for a counter spell that we haven't really seen before. Most of the time in Limited, your opponent will just be controlling one spell or ability, so this is basically just a fancy convolute that can also go after activated abilities, and convolute is usually a D+ or so. Now, it can get interesting sometimes when your opponent has multiple abilities and spells on the stack because this can counter all of them. How often will that happen though? Well, I don't think you should really count on getting a 2-for-1 with this. Still, I think the flexibility and big upside it can potentially have makes it a reasonable counter spell to run, but not when you're taking even remotely early. I think it's a C. And our last blue card is Witness of Tomorrows. For 4 generic and a blue, it's a 3/4 enchantment creature Sphinx at common. It's got flying, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to scry 1. 5 mana 3/4 flyers lately in Limited have been pretty solid. They're nothing special, but they've been more playable lately than I feel like they have been before. They've been somewhere around a C-. This comes with the additional upside of being able to scry for you. It's not the most exciting mana sink in the world, but it is one. It will improve the quality of your draws. If you're flooding out, you can at least scry 1 and maybe not flood out so bad. Plus, it's an enchantment and that has its minor upsides. I think this will be a solid playable for blue decks, giving it a C. Well, those were all the blue cards in Theros Beyond Death. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about all the black cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.